Hi, everybody. I would like to welcome you today to the Woman with Grit webinar. This is actually, I was just double checking with my colleague here. I think this is now our 7th series that we're having with regards to Woman with Grit. And this is an initiative that I personally started a couple of years ago with my move to Mauritius at the time. I've now been based in Mauritius for almost 5 years, and there was really, which I believed, there was not really a platform that existed for women in business, entrepreneurs, people that were adding back to the community that could have a voice and a platform. So it has been interesting because over this period of time, we have now gone to Zoom, which has been amazing because we've been able to reach a broader spectrum of women across the world. And really today, it's really significant that we are talking because it is International Women's Day. And I always joke, there shouldn't be one day to recognize women, there should be 365 days to recognize women. But be that as it may, we will take our day and take it graciously. And just from my side, it is amazing to have a young dynamic speaker join us today, Nkiru, and she's got really a fantastic profile, and really to our topic of achieving equality in the workplace. And this is something I get questioned running an Africa business, multi-geography African business. I often get questioned around equality in the workplace, and some of the key prevalent matters which I see being in real estate, being a woman. I ran a JSE, Johannesburg Stock Exchange real estate REIT. I think at that stage, there were only 3 female CEOs of around 46 listed REITs at the time. When we listed the Grit business in London in July 2018, I was the first woman-led business to list an African business in London. So, you know, this equality topic is really a very important topic to myself. And the best and the most support I can give women is to obviously demonstrate it in the Grit business. And as of to date, we boast over 45% women in management at Grit. More than half of our staff are women. We have a very diversified board with extraordinary women that sit on our board. So again, you know, sometimes instead of complaining, you need to lead by example. And I think the Grit business does that. Nakura, I would like you to give you the opportunity to obviously just give us a background on who you are. And you've obviously also got a very, very big job across the continent, and you've got some interesting stories to share. But I'd like you just to give the audience some background. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just share some really amazing themes around gender equality and what it means. I'm going to allow Nakura to share her story. I will be asking questions along the way just to make sure we get as much information out of her as possible. But at that point, I'd like to hand over to yourself just to give our audience just an understanding of who you are, your background, and really just leading from the front as you already are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn, not only for inviting me, but for those kind words of introduction as well. And it's really great to hear just briefly about how much Grit has been leading by example when it comes to empowering women in the workplace. I think, like you said, it's not just about voicing your complaints, which is important, but also showing an alternative and an ideal situation of how you'd like things to be. So it's really great to see Grit doing just that in Mauritius and across Africa. So my name is Nkiru Chamelu. I currently work at the United Nations office in Ethiopia as a partnerships and development finance specialist. But I've had a pretty long history working with the intersection between sustainable development, international development, issues like gender equality, human rights, climate, Africa, and private sector. So for the past 8 years, I've been working in the space of private sector engagement and partnerships, previously with the UN Global Compact, of which Grit is a member, and I believe also on the board of the Global Compact Network in Mauritius and the Indian Ocean region, which is another way that the company is leading by example, which is great. And then prior to that, I've worked in a number of fields. I actually really like to go into my background, not because I'm a narcissist, but also because I think so often people, especially younger people or people who are sort of early to mid-career, especially women, feel like they need to follow one path in their career in order to get to their objectives and achieve their goals. And a lot of people say that there are many paths that you can take, but it's very hard to actually see examples of that, which is why I like to tell my story, because I am an example of someone that has taken sort of many turns and detours to get to the path that I am. I think I've always been interested in issues of international relations and development issues. Being an African, obviously it's something that you see in your everyday life in terms of, areas where you live across the continent where there's a lack of human development, issues of gender equality, of food security, of inaccessible opportunities for economic empowerment or basic infrastructure, food, water, health. And so I think it's something that's always kind of lived in me, but it's always been something I think that has sort of existed in the periphery or sort of in the background of my other interests. And so across I like to say many different lives, because sometimes it feels like I've lived, 3 or 4 lives throughout my career. I have essentially followed my passions in terms of things that I've been interested in, skills that I've wanted to build, uh, ways that I've wanted to enrich myself or empower myself, and not necessarily stuck to, well, I want to work in development, or I want to work in Africa, or I want to work in this specific industry. And so I actually started out focused on economics, and I was an economics major in university and in my graduate studies. But then after that, I have a lot of interest and passion in creative writing and creative pursuits. I'm an avid sort of amateur writer myself. And so following graduation, I actually moved to China because that was another interest and passion of mine, is learning about Asian culture and living in Asia. And I lived in China for close to 3 years, working in areas of market development and market entry, and really just exploring and building my own knowledge about working in a completely different geographic area and a completely different culture, really sort of challenging myself and pushing myself into spaces where I've never been, which I think is really important for women. And when we talk about gender equality, I think so many of us have stories where we talk about being the only women in the room, or being, one of few, one of two. And I think that's what happens when you do push yourself. And so for me, I've actually now started to seek out opportunities where I am the only woman in the room. I don't necessarily always like it, but I think you need to make sure that there is a woman in the room. And if that only woman is you, then that's a good thing, because then you can take the opportunity to bring more women into the room. And so I spent a lot of time in China, really just kind of doing different things that interested me. And I think really for me, it was more of an opportunity for me to test myself, to challenge myself, and to build my own skills and sort of see how daring and bold I could be. And then after that, I moved to the United States, where I spent some time working in entertainment, actually. And so I was working in television production and development, something completely different from what I'm doing now. And yet still there's skills there, experiences there, opportunities there that I still recall and think about and apply to this day. So I think it's really important to recognize that there are a lot of skills and there is really a concrete way to build your professional career, not necessarily in the industry where you see yourself being or where you have an idea for yourself being. I think there are so many skills that are absolutely necessary across many different sectors, across many different industries, and you can build them in the most unlikely of places. I never would have thought my, public speaking skills, my presentation skills, my consulting skills would be built working in television production, but that's absolutely where I built most of them. So you really, again, I think have to be elastic in your thinking and be flexible, and also allow yourself to have fun. Follow the pursuits that are interesting to you, that you have a passion in, even if it's not something that you can see building a career out of. I think it's definitely worth it to explore it, because you never know how it can help to build the person that you will become. And so finally, after that, I think I then started to veer a bit more towards into the industry that I'm in now. I moved into consulting, where I worked in political risk analysis and consulting, working with a lot of clients that had operations and assets in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it was only at that time, having even been raised as an African, grown up in Africa, it was only then that I really started to fully engage on African issues in a very substantive and more professional way, as opposed to just in my personal life. And there is where I really, I think, formed my passion for wanting to work in Africa and really wanting to contribute to sustainable development. And then from there, I moved into the UN, which was about 8 years ago, working in Nairobi, and then in New York, and then in South Africa. And now I'm here in Ethiopia, and there are very real issues here. Those of you that have been following the news may be aware of the humanitarian crisis that's happening in northern Ethiopia, on top of COVID-19, which has already disproportionately impacted women and girls. But whenever there is a crisis situation, especially a conflict situation, women and girls are more vulnerable. They are the most impacted. So I think today on this International Women's Day, it's definitely a day for celebration, but I think also more importantly, it's a day for reflection, to reflect on how far we still need to go. There's so much more that we have to do when it comes to gender equity, gender equality, making sure that every woman and girl has the same equal opportunities as women and girls everywhere, but also as boys and men too. So I think it's a really important conversation to have, and it's a conversation we need to keep having, not just on the 8th of March. As Bronwyn said, I wish every day we could talk about these issues, but it's definitely good to have one day where we can really highlight it and make sure that it's in the global public consciousness.
Good, thank you. I think that was extremely insightful. And it is interesting. I mean, I think with what you ended there around just having true reflection, I think for me, it's, true reflection to understand how far we are yet to go, because of the extremity of what you're seeing, and the vulnerable being women and children, who seem to be the most gravely impacted out of these circumstances. And I also, continuously have reflection myself, as I'm sure you do, and I try to have my colleagues to have, is actually what an amazing platform we have and what we need to be able to use it. And we need to be able to be doing more from the platform that we have, and the gratitude for the platform that we've been given. And it really is fantastic to see you recognizing your platform, and actually taking it to the next level, which is fantastic. And even through our audience who's listening today, I just implore on you that even in the smallest way, that every single one of you have a platform. You might be aspiring yourself on this gender equality, but every one of you are in a position to have a voice, and everybody needs to use that voice, which is obviously very important. So, Nkuru, can I just ask you to really just delve, and let's just go into the topic, and what is gender equality actually? Is it a whole lot of women running around saying we're better than men? What is the heart and core of a gender equality, and really just understanding of what it ideally needs to look like. And I always have this, I always say, I boast these amazing stats for women that we have in our business, but they're there because of their abilities, and they're not there because they're necessarily women. And I think doing it for these type of things, and empowerment has to be done for the right reasons. It cannot be forced, because it has to be sustainable, and it has to be on a long-term basis. But just take us through your experiences across the African continent specifically. What does it look like? What does it need to look like? What are the challenges that we're facing? I might ask you questions during it, but if I can just give you the platform to just give us your voice and let us know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a big question. And there are, of course, no easy answers. I mean, gender equality, I think just as a definition, typically refers to equal rights, equal responsibilities, equal opportunities for men and women, and girls and boys. And I think it's also really important to make that differentiation of equal opportunities and equity between men and women and girls and boys. Because of course, how you disadvantage or advantage someone in their youth will definitely have an impact, and sort of a snowball effect as they get older as well. I think it's important to also make the distinction between equality and equity, because clearly men and women are not exactly the same. And so it's not about treating men and women the same. It's about recognizing where the differences are, and making special considerations, or really just any considerations to ensure that based on those differences, people are not negatively impacted or negatively disadvantaged, just based on whether they're born male or female. So making sure that they have the same access to all of the basic human rights that we should all enjoy, all of the basic opportunities for things like education and decent work. Making sure that these human rights, these rights that are afforded and privileges that should be afforded to everyone are actually afforded to everyone. And so that is the ideal state that we would want to be in. And clearly that's not the states that we're in now. There are so many statistics when it comes to just basic access to health. Basic access to education is an area where we see a huge disparity between girls and boys. I think increasingly now with the fourth industrial revolution, we also see now what is called the digital divide, where women are much less likely to have access to digital technologies, to internet technologies. And obviously, as we're moving to a more digitized world, that further disadvantages women when they don't have access to these opportunities as well. And so when we think about gender equality, obviously it's so contextualized, even down to the local level. I mean, gender equality issues can be different just depending on the city that you're in. It's different if you are in a city as opposed to if you're in a rural or more remote region. Within Africa, I think there are areas where we definitely have sort of surpassed the global averages, but obviously there are also areas where we are definitely still lagging behind. Africa as a region, on a global average tends to have more women's representation on corporate boards and executive committee positions than the global average. The global average is around 21, 22%. In Africa, it's 25%. So not a huge, reason for us to celebrate, but still, I think it's one area where we see across the board in Africa that we do slightly better. I think one area where we would like to see more improvement is that when you actually dig a little deeper into where women sit on executive committees or corporate boards, you find most of the times it's more in operational positions, less likely in strategic positions. So you see sort of, for example, chief human resource officers tend to be women, diversity officers, the non-executive board members, for example, the ones that chair up the social and ethics committees, those tend to be women. And so you find that even though across the board in Africa, you are seeing more of an improvement when it comes to women in leadership position, the type of leadership positions women still in, there still seems to be a barrier when it comes to, are these the types of positions that are strongly connected to making key strategic decisions that affect the company's future, and more importantly, affect how the company operates as well, affect the culture within the company, and affect sort of how the company thinks when it comes to gender equality. So these are still areas where we definitely need to make some improvements in Africa. I think when it comes to the wage gap, that's definitely an area where Africa is lagging behind. And again, you kind of have to dig a little deeper, because when you disaggregate for regions, you find some regions are better than others. North Africa is definitely, I think, one key area where the wage gap is huge. And countries like Algeria and Tunisia, we're looking at in the hundreds of percentages where men make 200% more than women for the same jobs at the same levels. In other areas, for example, in West Africa, Southern Africa, the wage gap is maybe sort of in the high 30%. So still, when it comes to getting equal pay for equal work, that's really an area where women need to be recognized. And I think we also need to make huge strides in gender equality. I think one of the key challenges, and this is probably the thorniest, most complex issue, is the way in which social, traditional, customary norms affect the way women are disadvantaged in the workplace and also outside of the workplace. But if we think about just in the workplace, the fact that for many women, they have two jobs. They have their 9-to-5 job within the workplace, and then they go home. And then they also have another full-time job that involves all of the domestic childcare, family care, household chores, managing the domestic space. And so this, of course, disadvantages women because they have less time and effort to put into work. They're limited in terms of their flexibility and pushing for issues like remote work and flexible work. I think because of COVID, there's been a lot of strides in that because people just simply can't go into work. It's not safe. Mm-hmm. But before COVID, it was quite difficult for women to be able to, work for 3 hours in the morning and then go home because they have a sick child to take care of and then work from home for the rest of the day. And still, I think even with remote working, you see, I think all of us have probably been on conference calls with colleagues and hear screaming children in the background crying. But how many of us have been on conference calls with our male colleagues and heard that as well? So I think still when we find ourselves in this remote work situation. It actually has compounded some of the burdens for women working, because now that work life and that home life is happening all the time at the same time. And so it can be quite a lot. I think another issue is really just the unconscious bias of it all. And this is probably one of the most difficult issues, because bias is so hard to identify. When you are being biased, it's something that you do sort of almost as a trigger. So you don't really have the time to stop yourself, and you also don't really have the time to even know that you're being biased. And I think we exist in a patriarchal society where norms and rules, conditions, institutions, systems have all been designed by men for men. And so I think it's very difficult when people who have existed within that dominant paradigm for so long have really just one sort of view of thinking. And so when they're presented with someone that does not fit within that norm or institution, does not sort of, look the part, whatever that means, of a CEO or of a supervisor, their unconscious bias kicks in, and that can negatively impact people who don't fit into that dominant paradigm, which tends to be, women, minorities, marginalized communities, the disabled. And so the unconscious bias issue is really something that is probably the hardest to tackle, because it's quite difficult to even start that conversation, which has to begin at the point of telling people you are biased. Whether you know it or not, you can say you are a feminist, you can say you support gender equality, but at the end of the day, you are biased because we exist within a biased system. And so I think it's really about having to push each other and challenge ourselves within the workplace, but also outside of the workplace, because so much of our thoughts and our beliefs and our biases come from outside of the workplace, but of course bleed into our work life, bleed into the office. And so I think, companies as an institution that can support gender equality really need to make the effort to push for more behavior change. A lot of this can be done through training, but I think a lot of it really starts at the tone at the top. And then again, we face the challenges of where you go into, entry-level positions, junior positions, and you see pretty good gender equality. In certain cases, you may even see 55% women or even 60% women. Management positions, senior management positions, executive management positions, all the women disappear. And it's all of a sudden just men. And so, there's something happening in those levels and that progressive movement that's removing the women. And there are many things happening. There's the unconscious bias when it comes to promotion. There's the fact that some women don't put themselves up for promotion because of the lack of flexibility, because of those childcare issues at home, the home life issues. And then I think also there's a lot of it that goes even before you get into the office, before you even get into the workplace, that happens in education, that happens at the girl child level, the boy child level, that needs to be addressed as well. So again, it's a very complex issue, and there are a lot of challenges. We are seeing, I think a lot of strides when it comes to the discourse around gender equality. I think one area where we really need to improve when it comes to that discourse is bringing more men into the conversation, having more men be part of discussions like these. So it's not just, women sort of talking to an echo chamber, but really it's a conversation about how can we bring men into the fight for gender equality.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think that's a really good point at the end that you brought up. And, I suppose this, sometimes in life, a challenge of this magnitude seems, it almost seems insurmountable because it's got so many different facets, as you've mentioned now. So, there's a corporate aspect, but then it just goes to grassroots as well, which is, just the access to healthcare, education, and those type of things. So it's what we would see as the basics, but those aren't even being fulfilled at the moment. But what I want to ask you specifically, actually I have two questions, but the first question I want to ask you is, what are the real projects that you've worked on with businesses that you've seen really good stride in initiatives? Because ultimately, we understand the challenges, and often we need a realization about the extremity of the challenges, because we think things are progressing amazingly, but they're actually not. I think they come off such a low base, so we think we're doing amazingly, but we're actually not. But what are the real projects that you've worked on, whether it's a corporate, whether it's institutional, that you have worked on just around the gender equality and been able to education and really been able to implement that in whatever sphere? Are there anything interesting that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many projects happening, I would say, for the most part, especially when you bring private sector into the conversation, but even just talking about key development actors like the UN, the World Bank, the large development agencies, gender equality is probably one of the top issues that they all focus on, because it does have sort of a spillover effect when it comes to education, when it comes to health. Women are much more likely than men to invest in education. They're much more likely than men to invest in health. So when you invest in women, you're also investing in these other development issues as well. So there's a clear incentive, at least for on the development side, on the NGO, on the government side, to invest in women, because you're also then investing in these other areas. On the business side, I mean, I think the case still has to be made. For some companies, I think they are fully getting it. Some of the larger companies, they recognize that they need more women in the leadership space, in the executive space. And so a lot of the programs you find, especially when it's about engaging business, really focus still on just the education aspect, the awareness raising, the capacity building, the reporting aspect, which is really important too, because you'll have a CEO stand up and say, women are very empowered in our organization, 60% of our employees are women. But then when you sort of dig a little deeper, are you tracking, whether there's equal pay between your male and female employees at the same level? Are you tracking what the road for promotion and advancement is, disaggregated by sex and gender? Are you tracking what the pipeline is to go from middle management to senior management to executive management by that pipeline as well? Just getting companies also into the practice of setting specific and ambitious goals and targets for gender equality is really important. I think there's a lot of sort of targeted work in terms of how to improve women's advancement in society. A lot of it tends to be sort of categorized by, for example, there's workplace, economic empowerment. There's a lot of work happening in the UN around supporting, educating, and encouraging more women to get engaged in politics. Africa, I think, has some standout examples. For example, here in Ethiopia, there's a high number of women that are part of the parliament. We have a female president here. Rwanda is often cited because their parliament is about 60% women. The studies are quite clear, actually, that when you have more women in your governance structure, whether it's public or private, you actually have more transparent governance. There's less levels of corruption, corporate governance is stronger. So again, I think those are clear incentives that we're really trying to drive both on the public side and the private side. ITC, which is the International Trade Center, they do a lot of work around women in trade. And so bringing women into supply chains, when it comes to women's economic empowerment in Africa, you cannot talk about it without talking about entrepreneurship. Because the majority of entrepreneurs in Africa are women, but most of them are in the informal sector. So these are not, formalized, registered companies. These are informal institutions, whether they're hair salons or catering companies or, some kind of service sector, even down to the basic sort of, petty trader who sells goods and products on the side of the street. So a lot of focus is around bringing women out of the informal sector, where there are less opportunities, there's more vulnerabilities, there's more risk of unsafe work practices, and bringing them into the formal sector through training, through capacity building, but also linking them up to viable markets as well. I think a lot of the issues that women face is sort of the lack of the sort of three key structures that you need for a business. The first is you need access to finance. Businesses need capital to be able to grow, to be able to invest. Business need access to markets, to have trade partners, to be able to sell their goods, to get foreign exchange as well, depending on the size of the company. And they also need training and capacity building as well. And so a lot of the work that we do at the UN through ITC, through the UN Development Program, through UN Women. A lot of it is focused around trying to empower women by giving them those three key factors. So the access to finance, access to markets, and the training and capacity building. And then there's a lot of work that revolves around women's health, women's and children's health. Because again, when you're investing in women's health, you're investing in children's health as well, because that's where women will put their efforts, is in their children's health. And so again, that begins with education, just educating women about basic sanitation. Obviously with COVID, there's been huge campaigns being run, not just in Africa, but around the world, around basic sanitation, hand washing, making sure you're using clean water. But I think really key is improving health infrastructure in Africa, making sure that women have the access to be able to go for contraceptives, to be able to go for regular checkups, to have a place to be able to take their children. And so a lot of the work around gender equality is really just ensuring that women have that access to the basic human rights. But increasingly, I think we're seeing a lot more agencies focus around economic empowerment and political participation. And they're now also bringing in different partners as well to support. So working with NGOs, working with private sector to make sure that women are in the spaces where decisions are being made, whether it's in the boardroom or whether it's in the courtroom or whether it's in the parliament room. So that's really important.
Yeah, so I mean, and listening to you speak, and it's probably something that I've personally been thinking about for some time, is that, and I look at my own journey, and I suppose even your own journey, and I think we end up with sort of crossroads in our lives around which way we go, and is that sort of the choice, maybe to be a full-time mom, maybe to take a different job, maybe to do this because of our sort of we're managing a whole facet of things. And I look at my trajectory into where I've got to, and and I look behind me and try to understand why we aren't having a mass amount of women being able to sort of follow the same road, and how people make different choices. And it is interesting because I think there's these junctures or these crossroads that we all faced with in our lives. And I personally, if I look back in history of my own life, and having a mother who was in a divorce or in a marriage that she couldn't get divorced because she wasn't financially secure. And I remember growing up with that sort of family and looking at it and thinking, I never want to be in a position where I have to stay with a partner because that's the only, it's in the means to an end. So I remember there being many things that happened in my life that became drivers for me to ultimately set up my own business and my own success, and really just be the custodian of my own future. But I also look at certain things, and I've got two girls that are 12 and 9 years old. And I look at times over the raising of them and junctures whereby I was criticized for traveling too much, working too hard. And I've always had this concept that it takes a mother and father, but it takes a village to raise a child. I mean, I'm from Africa, and I believe it takes a village because children get a magnitude of experiences from different people. And that's the route I've chosen. But, it is interesting because I think, as you, said earlier, is that, there's a whole lot of other things, sort of challenges that are faced onto women that they might have the capability, they might even have the self-confidence, but they choose different journeys because they have other pressures put on them. And, one of my biggest things, and possibly you feel the same way, is to try and create an educational awareness that you are able to run it all. And you might not do it at 100% every day of your life, and you might not feel like you're successful every day of your life, but there's so much value to be added to be able to have the opportunity to raise a family, to run a business, to all of these things. And, for me, that's a massive education process. And I think we lose a lot of very good women along the way because of crossroads that they come to. Now, I don't know if you feel the same, or even in your own history or career where you could have gone a different way because of these other factors that were put on you at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an important discussion to have as women, because I think these are sort of the tiny decisions that we don't realize that we make every day to sort of take one route or the other. And I think a lot of the restrictions that we have or the options that we're given are quite gendered in that, if I was a man, I wouldn't have to think about, oh, should I take this position because it requires me to travel a lot, and how is that going to affect my home life? And that's definitely things that I've thought about. In my previous position, it did require a lot of travel, and women typically do not go for positions like that, because obviously having to be away from home does affect your home life, where women, of course, are seen to be, the primary caregiver and the primary sort of role taker when it comes to managing the home life. And that did, I think, it was something that I had to factor into, instead of just thinking of it as a professional decision, but also in terms of how it would affect my personal life and whatever personal goals that I had. And I think that's definitely something that every woman has to face at various points in her career. And I think, especially as you move up in your career, I think the average that they say, which is, a bit depressing actually, is that most women sort of peak at 40 in their professional career. That's where they sort of get their highest earning opportunity, and that's typically where they reach the highest position that they'll get in the workplace, which is quite depressing. And I think the decisions and the conversations that you have with yourself when it comes to professional decisions and how it will affect you personally are very different when I was 20 than there are when I was 25 even, and then when I was 30, and now when I'm 35. And so I think a lot of it is really, and I find I fall into this trap myself, but I think I see this also in a lot of women, especially working women, is that we very much sort of lock ourselves into the dichotomy of wanting to check all the boxes or wanting to sort of throw all the boxes away. And so it's, you want to have the career, but you also want to get married and have the children and be great in the workplace and also in the home place as well. And then other women will sort of see that either through their mothers or through, other experiences they've had, and say, no, I don't want to do any of that. I want to sort of, eschew all social norms and kind of set my own path. And I think so much of what we do is always a reflection of what society expects of us. Even if we don't do it, I think a lot of times it's almost a sort of refutation of what society expects of us. And we have to sort of ask ourselves, is this really what I want? Or is this what I was told that I wanted all my life? Or am I just being contrarian to what society expects of me? And I think these are conversations that a lot of women are increasingly having, for example, when it comes to having children. I know just from my personal experience, I don't have any children yet. And it's something, growing up in Nigeria, it's something that they pretty much, they start asking you the question of when you're going to get married and have kids pretty much around 19, 20. And by the time you're 26, 27, you're considered a spinster. I actually was, I think, 25, and my uncle quite matter-of-factly called me a spinster, as if that was just the technical term for an unmarried 25-year-old. And I was aghast, and he was just completely oblivious as to why I would find that in any way offensive. But I think so much of the expectations that are put on women, working women, are paradigms that were devised 40, 50 years ago by different generations that don't have the situation that we have now, and don't have the opportunities that we have now. When my mother was growing up, she was growing up in a very different time in Nigeria than it is now, and she simply didn't have the opportunities for economic self-empowerment that I have. And so for her and for her sisters and for her peers, her main opportunity for economic empowerment was to get married to someone who could be successful or who already was successful. And so for her, I think, whether she wants to or not, that to her still feels like something that is important to do, is for a woman to get married, because that's so inculcated in the culture in which she grew up in. But for my generation, it's very different. Obviously, marriage is still a key part of any woman's journey, if she wishes and chooses it to be. But increasingly, you find, in Nigeria and in many parts of Africa, a lot of women are choosing to wait much longer to get married. And some women are choosing, maybe to never get married. I think at least something that I've been seeing a lot of in Nigeria is long-term partnerships, where you have people that are in committed relationships and they're just, for whatever reason, are choosing not to get married. Some of the statistics are actually quite, again, depressing. It seems like a lot of times when you talk about gender equality, the statistics are always kind of depressing. But there is a statistic, I don't know if it was based just in the US or if it was more than one country, that showed that men predominantly report themselves as being happier and better off after marriage, and women predominantly report themselves as being less happier and worse off after marriage. And so it shows the institution of marriage for some can actually be more of a burden for women than it is for men. And so I think, these are conversations that people are just starting to have now. And I think we're lucky to live in a society. And again, every society is different, but I think the conversation among more urbane, educated, higher income, independent women is much different than the conversation used to be even just 10 years ago. And I think the opportunities are much different as well, especially for women who are married and work and have children. I think they have way more opportunities than they did before. But still, it is still quite difficult. And I think a lot of women do still have to sacrifice their career or take steps back or have to sort of make compromises that men simply just don't even have to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just chuckling at some of those things because it is, but as you correctly said, the conversation has been had and continuing, which is really exciting to hear that. So I just want to see if we've got any questions, Sandrini. So if you don't mind, if I can just ask anybody to raise their hand, well, not literally your hand, but your hand in your on I think we're on Zoom. If you can just raise your hand emoji on Zoom, please, so we can see if there are any questions, or just type your question. There's a box for you to type your questions up. So Sandrini's next to me, my colleague, so she'll be taking any questions at this point. So I don't know if there are any questions, Sandrini, if you can see. So I suppose just to share two funny stories from my side, and sometimes I always chuckle because, as you correctly said, I think about your uncle calling you a spinster. You can choose to be upset or you can just see it for what it is. But when I started, I co-founded Grit 7 years ago, and I remember raising capital at the time. And as we know, capital equity is very difficult to raise. And I remember going to one of our investors, a Zimbabwean chap, and managed to work quite a large pension fund. And I remember telling him what our aspiration is, investment strategy and multi-geography and multi-Africa and countries. And this is what we wanted to do. And he looked at me very seriously at the time, and he said, Bronwyn, I just want to know one thing from you. And I looked at him and I thought, here we go. He's going to ask me this technical question, like, I'm not going to know what's going on. And he basically looked at me and he said, all I want to know is, can you drink beer with the Nigerians? And I never forget that he saw this blonde woman who thought, what the hell are you going to go be doing in Africa? And I always chuckle because if anybody knows me, they know that I can drink beer, and as much with the Nigerians. So I definitely shattered that glass ceiling. But it is amazing that when it comes to, and again, and he's actually still a very good friend of mine. So, I had to take it where it comes from, because we do have to realize that at women is that we also can't stand on our soapboxes and take offense at these things. That, sometimes, as you correctly said, it's inherently cultural and sits in the culture of people. And actually, they also don't understand, And the second story is I joined a very amazing association in Mauritius, and actually was one of their first female members. And they were dividing it out into groups, and basically the head of the association looked at me and he said, Bronwyn, what do we do with you? Where do we put you? And I said, well, you can actually put me with the other men. I think, I'm not going to eat them. They're going to be fine. So, it's these type of things. And again, it's just, instead of getting upset, we actually have to respect where people come from and their own experiences and their own understanding. And again, it's about going into these things and leading from the front and actually making them realize that we're not a nuance, we're not this thing that stands on the side and they don't know what to do with, that we can actually add value, we can become part of the team. And it's a big educational process. And I think, that's my message with those two very funny stories, and I've encountered many more, is to really, everybody has the opportunity to look at that. So I think we do have a question, which I'm going to put out to yourself. So it is an interesting question, this. So, obviously under the corporate governance structure, and it's something you discussed earlier. And the question is what are your thoughts and what are you seeing in the markets that you operate around the acceptance of more women on boards, in board positions, more female chairperson roles, which is quite interesting because I think we're going up all the different levels. But what are you seeing? Are you seeing some interesting movements? Are things still quite slow on the take-up? I know you mentioned positions more around HR and operational, being more strategic roles. But from your experience with dealing with some of these businesses, are there some nice examples? Have you seen this happening, or is there still a way to go?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely still a long way to go when it comes to executive positions, board chair, or even just board positions, and ensuring that you have proper gender representation and gender equality there. I would say, South Africa, standards for gender representation at the board position for listed companies. And as a result of those actions, we have seen an increase on more women on boards. And so I think whenever you have those external influencers, those drivers that can kind of sort of needle companies, because companies will always say, yes, we want to change, we want to improve, but they'll really just kind of do the very, least that they have to do in order to quiet people and shut them up for at least the next 5 years before the conversation gets up and going again. And so I think whenever you can have, leading institutions that are very influential, like stock exchanges, obviously governments, but even just the voice of the people, especially as consumers, to really push large institutions to make change within a faster period of time, it definitely helps, and you actually do see improvements in that. So I would say, in the countries where there are specific policies and regulations for women's representations on boards, those are the countries where you have the highest representation of women on boards. And so clearly it shows that you do need to have these external drivers, at least for the time being, in order to push more companies to bring more women on boards. And I mean, I think also, again, it's really just about showing the case that it definitely does not hurt your company to have more women on boards. And in most cases, we've actually seen that it helps. And so I think a big issue that you always have when you have these discussions about setting targets and quotas is that, oh, well, then, it'll just push us or create a situation where we have to get all of these unqualified women just because we have to meet these quotas. And the issue is not that there aren't qualified women. That's never been the issue. The reason why the majority of CEOs are men, the majority of board members are men, it's not because there's a lack of unqualified women. It's because qualified women are not giving the same opportunities as qualified men. And so it's really about creating systems that acknowledge the discrepancies and acknowledge these areas for bias and discrimination, and trying to overcome them to give those opportunities. And so I think that's really kind of the conversation that needs to be had and needs to take over that ongoing rebuttal and conversation around just there not being enough qualified women in the space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with you. Absolutely. So the other question that I've got here, which is always, it's an interesting one, actually. It's also something I've debated and deliberated, is that, it's this whole question around how women can support each other to achieve gender equality. There's always been this sort of elephant in the room where, there tends to be, there's all these all boys clubs, but there's not really a concept of all women clubs. And the intention of actually women pushing forward women, and what that actually means, because the reality is that it does happen in these sort of male-dominated run institutions. So I'd be interested to hear your view. Are you seeing more of it? Could there be more done? What are your views on women supporting women?
Yeah, this is definitely one area where I think, the onus and the burden is on women. And this is one area where I would say women are definitely failing. Typically at the junior middle manager level, that's typically where you find people that have mentors and are looking for sponsors to help them advance. And we find statistically that men and women at that level have equal opportunities for mentorship. So women, it's not harder for women to get mentors. It's not easier for men to get mentors. But when it comes to sponsorship, and the difference between sponsorship and mentorship is really key in the workplace. Mentorship is just someone that has, guidance, experience, advice to give you, to help you in your career. Sponsorship is someone who actually takes a concerted effort to help you advance. So a sponsor is someone that when there's the next hiring committee meeting and they happen to be a part of it, says, hey, this person is actually really good. I think we should consider them for this position. There is where we find the gender discrepancy, is that men are 3 times more likely to be sponsored than women. And this is across the board by women and by men. So women are more likely to sponsor men than they are likely to sponsor other women. So this is really one key area where I think women really need to step up, is by sponsoring other women. And I think it's absolutely the priority and the responsibility for any women in a position of power. And I think all positions can have some kind of power. So even if you're in middle management, it's important to recognize what areas and opportunities you have to sponsor other women that are at junior level, and to really utilize that, because that's really where women need support. It's not so much mentorship. Women, we have mentors coming out of the ears. It's really in the sponsorship, and someone that's actually willing to take a stake in us and say, I'm going to help you move forward as I move forward. And so I think creating systems for that within the workplace, actually having a club, a women's club, I don't think is the worst idea. But even just having informal platforms and systems where you can meet other women in the workplace to get to know them a little bit better, and to see, who are those diamonds in the rough, who are the ones that you think really have a lot of promise and you can help sponsor, because that's really the only way that we're all going to move up together. They say, a rising tide raises all ships. And that's the case with men, but that's not the case with women, because women statistically don't pull each other up as they move up in the workplace. And that's definitely an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think that's probably a key comment to go out to our audience, because a lot of our audience have the ability to do that within their own positions and that. So I think there's 2 comments which came through, not questions, which I found very interesting, actually. Our COO, Moira, put a comment out going on what you said earlier, that she was actually asked by Sandrini, our organizer, if we should open this up to men to listen in. And Moira said, oh, no, we shouldn't. So she's just chuckling at herself, because actually what you said is 100% correct, is that, we should be getting not just women that are obviously supporting gender equality, but it's good to have both the voice from men and women. So I think what you said is actually really, really important. And I'm just thinking about all of our women-led initiatives that we definitely need to get the men in our business to drive it as well. So I think that's a really good observation from yourself. And, this is something that with another comment that was brought up by a highly successful woman. She's actually dialed into this, and she actually brought up a really interesting topic. And I think, really around this work-life balance concept. So, this work-life balance word, I hate using it, because I don't think it necessarily even exists. I think it's that unicorn floating around. So I think it's about how well you manage the best you can at the time. But she brought up a really good point, and it's about sort of quality, not quantity of time. And I think that goes to any relationship we have. And again, speaking about my own girls, is that I'm so cognizant when I am present to be present. And there are a number of instances where you will see full-time parents being at home, that they might be there in body, but they're not there in mind. And I think that's what a lot of women need to realize. And Kathy's one of our board members, and she's brought this up, and she has a very similar experience to myself. And we both have raised kids and are raising children. And we're seeing that this is, a really, really key aspect, is that we laden with this guilt, and as women, we carry guilt for everything, and, world issues, and our families and our husbands and our everybody we carry guilt for. But the reality is the concept of quality time is so important. And I think that is really, really a good point. And, I think when you do see also my comment to the audience and obviously what you've heard today is that where you are able to meet women that have careers and families, et cetera, is to really just ask the questions and sometimes ask the difficult questions. And especially for myself, and I know Kathy, you'll get the real answers. And sometimes it doesn't always work out. And I've recently gone through a divorce, and I was, one of the other things I was chuckling about, not the divorce, but the fact I've changed my name back to my maiden name, which is Knight. So I'm now Bronwyn Knight, not Corbett. And I got about 6 messages back saying, congratulations on getting married. Finally, you've got married. And I thought not one of them actually thought that I come back to my maiden name. So I did laugh at just the assumption that I must have got married finally. So I was on the shelf and I've got married. So I was chuckling about that. But, we've also had our failures and we've also had our journeys. And I think yourself the same. And what I implore on the women around and who are dialed in today is ask the questions, because we're all people at the end of the day and we've all had these experiences. And some have worked out and some haven't. So I think on that note, Nkuru, please can I just ask for your parting words? If you can leave our audience with a statement that's going to get them all thinking, because I think we do need to be shaken up and we can all do our part. So, and really thank you for joining us today. I'll thank you and then I'll ask you to leave with a parting statement. I think just your energy and what you're doing is tremendous. And please continue to reach out to us. And if you need help from us as an organization or stories or initiatives, we really, as the private sector, are more than willing and able to assist in some of these initiatives. So maybe some parting words for our audience, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I think this has been great, and I hope it's been a useful conversation for those in attendance. I think maybe my first point would just be, it really does make a difference when you have women at the top. I think the fact that we're having this conversation says a lot. The fact that, this is a company with a female founder, female CEO, and conversations like this are being prioritized on International Women's Day. That's definitely something that you likely would not see at a lot of male-led companies. And so I think, it's the small things that really help. And this is why you do need to have that diversity of gender and that diversity of thought at all levels of decision-making, but definitely at the top levels of decision-making. I think I would also say, for us as women, there are no easy answers. And I think there is no one way to do things. So often when we think of ambition, it's so linked to professional career and our jobs. But I think you can be ambitious in your personal life too. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to put your ambition and channel it towards your home life and towards your children and towards your partner or your spouse, and say work is just something that I do, to live. And so I think a lot of times we beat ourselves up because we need to be equally ambitious at home and equally ambitious in the workplace. And that's not necessarily the case. I think put your ambition where your passion is, because that will make you the most happiest. And I think if your passion is in your family, then absolutely that's where you should put your ambitions. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. And there is no right way or wrong way to be a woman. We're all just kind of figuring it out still after a millennia of doing this. And so, there's no one path to take. And I think it's really important for us to have these platforms to share, but also I think use them not so much to compare, but really to say, okay, this is someone who's done something completely different and they're happy and that's great. And so I think it's really important for us to talk to each other more, but not just talk, but really to be more action oriented. And I think this goes back to the discussion around mentorship and sponsorship, is that we really should take more action when it comes to helping other women along. I think so often when you're sort of in the fight for gender equality, you're kind of just focused on that goal, whether it's equal pay or maternal leave or getting more women into executive positions. And so often we don't sort of look to our left or right and look at our peers and say, okay, well, how can I help you move along? I'm just sort of focused on the finish line. but I should be looking at other people who are sort of running the same race and see how we can do it together. And I think having more platforms for that, even if it's just informal, even if it's just two of you, I think it's really important to do. And really that is sort of the secret to success for men. Men have been doing that all along. Men are extremely good at helping each other succeed and creating networks for each other to succeed. They're actually extremely generous in the workplace. I actually remember reading an article about how men exhibit more generosity in the office than they do in their personal lives. And so I think we also need to sort of take some of the practices that men have been using for generations and apply that to how we work, and to be more generous with each other in our office life, and see how we can, you know, be very specific about helping other women within our workplace succeed.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's great, a great passing comment. So I think just to thank everybody for joining us, and just a reminder, you know, Women with Grit, our business is called Grit, but really what it stands for, and it really goes to the heart of women for us, is the guts, the resilience, the innovation, and the tenacity. So for us, it really is, it clearly demonstrates the makeup of women, and we're very, very, you know, honored to carry that brand, and myself specifically. So really, thank you for your insights, and it was really wonderful to have you today. And I'm looking forward to further engagements in that going forward with yourself. So, and thank you to the amazing woman, and happy Women's Day, everybody. I think one of the gents walked past me earlier and said happy birthday, and I said, well, thank you, but it's actually Women's Day. But I think at least he said happy something. So I think happy Women's Day to everybody, and may Women's Day continue beyond today. I think that's really, really an important message. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and happy International Women's Day to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.